How does a 2-year-old boy just vanish from his own front yard in the middle of the day with family nearby? It's a question that has haunted the small community of Azalea, Oregon for over 3 decades now. So today, we're going to dive into the truly perplexing and tragic story of Thomas Gibson, a case that, you'll see, has far more questions than answers. Right, this is the question. On March 18th, 1991, this very question became a family's waking nightmare. In this tiny community of Azalea, Oregon, the disappearance of little 2-year-old Thomas Gibson kicked off an investigation that would take some of the most unexpected and, frankly, heartbreaking twists and turns imaginable. At the very center of this whole mystery is Thomas Gibson, a toddler who, for all intents and purposes, just vanished into thin air. But what makes this case so incredibly complex from the get-go is that the last person to see him was his own father. And his father was a local sheriff's deputy. That one detail would end up casting a very long shadow over this entire investigation. Okay, so let's set the scene. It was a Monday morning, seemed totally normal. Larry Gibson, the sheriff's deputy, decides to go for a run. He leaves his 2 little kids, Thomas and 4-year-old Karen, playing out in the front yard. But just before he takes off, he says he fired his pistol at a stray cat, which right off the bat is a pretty strange and jarring detail that investigators would later look at very, very closely. So 45 minutes later, Larry gets back from his jog and it's quiet. Too quiet. His son is nowhere to be found. A frantic search starts immediately. Family, neighbors, everyone is combing the property, calling out his name. But nothing. There was just no sign of him. Within an hour, a massive official search was underway, but that little boy was just gone. So with absolutely no physical evidence to go on, the investigation had to turn to the only other person who was right there who might have seen what happened. Thomas's 4-year-old sister, Karen. And what Karen told them was absolutely chilling. She said a man and a woman in an old tan-colored truck just drove right up, took her little brother, and then drove away. I mean, a brazen kidnapping. And what's more, a neighbor actually backed this up later, saying they'd seen a similar truck near the Gibsons' property. Suddenly, the word of a 4-year-old girl was at the absolute center of this huge investigation. And this is where things start to get really complicated. Because right from the beginning, there were 2 very different stories taking shape. On one hand, you've got this tragic abduction story. But on the other hand, investigators started noticing some odd things about the father's behavior. Like in the middle of this frantic search, he takes a shower and changes into his uniform, and they found 7 unexplained miles on his patrol car's odometer. Just little things that didn't quite add up. And within 6 weeks, the whole focus of the investigation had shifted. Larry Gibson went from grieving father to prime suspect. In the year after Thomas disappeared, the Gibson family actually moved to Montana, probably trying to escape the tragedy. But the strain was just too much, and the marriage completely fell apart. By 1993, the mother, Judith, had moved back to Oregon with the kids. And that's when the foundation of this entire case just cracked wide open. You have to remember, for 3 long years, the abduction story was the only official account of what happened. It was all anyone had. But once Karen was away from her father, living back in Oregon with her mom, that story, it didn't just change. It completely flipped, turning the whole investigation on its head. Now, Karen is 7 years old. She's physically separated from her father, and she apparently felt safe enough to finally reveal what she says she truly saw on that day. And it was a story so much darker, so much more disturbing than any stranger abduction. It pointed the finger directly at her own father. This one horrifying statement from a 7-year-old girl changed everything. The story about the strangers in the truck, she now claimed that was a lie, a story she was forced to tell. The truth, she said, was that her father was the one responsible for her brother's disappearance. In her new testimony, Karen described this scene of just unimaginable horror. She said she watched from a window as her dad slapped Thomas over and over again out in the carport. She then saw him put Thomas's little motionless body into a bag, hide it in the trunk of his patrol car, and later, he threatened to kill her if she ever spoke about what she saw. It's a story of a child's absolute terror. So in April of 1994, based almost entirely on his daughter's new account, Larry Gibson was arrested and charged with the second-degree murder of his son. The news just sent shockwaves through the community, splitting friends and neighbors right down the middle, forcing everyone to take sides in a case that had already torn this family apart. The trial really hinged on one impossible question: who do you believe? The prosecution's entire case rested on Karen's testimony. Her aunt also testified that Larry had basically confessed to her in a phone call. But the defense, well, they painted a very different picture. They argued that Karen was a young, impressionable kid who had been coached by her mother during a really bitter separation. The jury was left to decide. Was this a child finally revealing a repressed traumatic memory? Or was this a family tragically imploding on itself? In March of 1995, the jury came back with its verdict. They didn't find Larry Gibson guilty of murder, which would have meant he intended to kill his son. Instead, they convicted him on the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter. This suggests they believed he was responsible for Thomas's death, but that it wasn't premeditated. And the sentence that followed, well, it shocked a lot of people. He was sentenced to between 15 and 18 months in prison. But because he'd already served 12 months just waiting for the trial, Larry Gibson was released in less than a year. A really controversial outcome for a man convicted of killing his own 2-year-old son. So a man was convicted for his son's death. But with no body ever found, there could be no funeral, no final resting place. Larry Gibson served his time, but the most fundamental piece of this whole puzzle, Thomas himself, was and still is missing. It's just a void that can never, ever be filled. You know, this case really resonated with people in the 90s. It became a fixture in pop culture. It was profiled twice on Unsolved Mysteries, and Thomas Gibson's face became known to millions as the youngest child featured in that famous Soul Asylum music video, Runaway Train. And then, in what might be the most bizarre twist of all, after Larry Gibson was released from prison, he started a website asking for the public's help to find his son, the son he was convicted of killing. The legal chapter of this case might be closed, but the story is obviously far from over. A verdict was reached, a sentence was served. But with no remains ever found, there's no real closure. And so the question just lingers, this haunting echo from that spring morning back in 1991. Where is Thomas Gibson? And will we ever truly know what happened in that front yard?